Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Totally Tanked, the podcast in which we talk about tanks, because why wouldn't you? My name is John and I am joined in this podcast by Andrew.
Hi, John.
How are you tonight?
Good. Yeah. Looking forward to talking about tanks.
Tanks.
One tank in particular.
One tank, yes. And what tank are we talking about tonight?
We're going to talk about the Matilda. Now, it is the Matilda II.
Yes. The only Matilda that really matters.
Yeah, it's the famous Matilda.
Yep.
So we'll just refer to it as the Matilda, as opposed to Matilda II or any of its other iterations.
Yeah, which was the infantry tank Mark II A12 or something along those lines, I think.
I would not remember that. I remember it was an infantry tank, though, but the actual technicalities of it.
And we will talk later about what an infantry tank is. But you wanted to tell a story related to the Matilda.
Yeah. One of my initial introductions to tanks was through a Commodore 64, which is going to date me, a Commodore 64 computer game where you could design your own scenarios for war games, and it came with a few scenarios, and one of them was set in North Africa, and you were in command of the Germans, and you were faced with a Matilda tank. You could not destroy that Matilda tank with any of your anti-tank weapons or your artillery, so you had to somehow delay what was going on at the front while you brought a 88 up to be able to blow that tank up. And it's really stuck with me. I don't know the technicalities of the game or even how I played it or how I dealt with the scenario, but it did stick with me that the entire German army was brought to a standstill by a Matilda tank while you brought up an anti-aircraft gun to blow that tank up.
Although it should be noted that with the Matilda's miserable top speed of 8 miles per hour off-road, it wasn't that hard to hold a Matilda tank up.
No. But I think within the boundaries of this this particular scenario, they were dealing basically with the armor side of it.
It seemed like the inexorable hand of God.
Yeah, the mobile warfare wasn't such a big part of this scenario. I don't think so much as how do you get rid of this tank, and how do you get the logistics of getting a gun from the back up to the front while I presume holding off the British. As I said, I don't remember the ins and outs of the scenario, but just that this Matilda tank was apparently indestructible in the face of anything except this one gun that you had.
Which was not even meant to be an anti-tank gun, because it was an anti-aircraft gun that just happened to be so enormous that it was quite good at... Only the Germans would build an anti-aircraft gun that was better at blowing up tanks, wouldn't they?
And I guess that's the logistics of why it was somewhere in the back, not at the front, to deal with the aircraft that were shooting at your supply lines.
I did once see someone asking online, well, why didn't the Allies develop something like the 88? And the answer was because their anti-tank guns worked.
Yep. Yeah, they didn't need it.
Look, let's briefly try for our listeners to describe what a Matilda tank looks like.
Well, to me, it looks like a box with another box on top.
I would say it's actually one of the very first tanks that actually looks like how we imagine a tank to look.
Yeah, I think you're right. Even if you look at its predecessor, it looked more like it didn't look like the modern tanks. And yeah, this does look like a modern tank. I mean, it's got some slopes on its armor for a start.
Yep.
Which was not a common thing, I don't think, up until World War II. There's obviously, I'm going to be wrong on that, and there will be examples that don't.
But I mean, the German Panzers, even up to the Tiger, were incredibly boxy.
Yeah, so it wasn't a common thing. It had guards on its tracks.
Yeah, so these huge armoured skirts, which makes it look unbelievably painful to do anything maintenance-wise with the skirts.
And I understand it was unbelievably painful to do anything maintenance-wise with the Matilda tank.
Yeah, but on the bright side, it moves so slowly that you didn't upset the tracks very often.
No. Yeah. Okay, yeah, you're correct there. And so when you did have to do maintenance, it was probably because someone had tried to get it to go too fast. So 10 miles an hour?
Yeah. Now, getting to what we'll get deeper into the design, but it's got a very small little turret with what looks like quite a small little gun. And apparently they managed to fit 3 men into this turret. Which it helped that the gun was so really small, so it really wasn't taking up much space. But it did pioneer that design, which is still standard, certainly in Western tanks, of having a tank commander, a gunner, and a loader all crammed into a turret.
Yeah, okay, that's news to me, so that's great. I think with that tank design and that small turret, it probably gave it some survivability as well in terms of actually targeting it and hitting it and looking for weak points. I would guess that aside from the thick armor, there was not much else to shoot at.
It helps to not get hit in the first place, doesn't it?
Yeah. So given its slow speed, I'm guessing that it was an easy target from that perspective. But given its size and the fact that it did not have a humongous turret bulging out everywhere, probably did help it in terms of its survivability. What are your thoughts on that?
I think everything prior to this, and even getting into like the Panzer 1 and 2s, just still look a little alien to us. You've got those World War One tanks with their giant rhombuses, and the interwar tanks. They've all got
multi-turrets
multi-turrets, or they've got great huge the tracks up front, and then they sort of go the tracks form a triangle shape. And the Matilda sort of is just it looks like a tank should look. It's kind of one of those things where they say with planes that if it looks right, it flies right. And even though this was a weird little backwards tank in all sorts of funny ways, and also otherwise it was perfect for its time.
And do you think that's what lent to its longevity in terms of its use on the battlefield?
I think its longevity entirely came down to the fact that bus diesel technicians could work on it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But we will get to that with operational history. Okay. So tell me a bit about the design history on this one.
As I understand it, they envisaged it as carrying a machine gun, and so and supporting infantry, rather than it being a tank designed to go out and blow up other tanks.
Yeah, I mean people are often critical of this British theory of cavalry tanks and infantry tanks, and then they sort of had cruiser tanks for tanks in the middle, but they weren't main battle tanks by any means. And anyone who's too critical of that theory needs to look at what the Americans are doing, their tank destroyer theory, which was unbelievably terrible.
Yeah.
And we'll get to why there were no engines for British tanks a little later. But when your tank moves as slowly as this does, it does present some issues.
Well, they thought it was a bonus because the infantry...
It wouldn't outrun the infantry.
Yeah. So there's at least the infantry, if they had to get to a canter, could keep up with the tank.
There is that, but there's also the funny thing that by 1939, the British had the only fully mechanised army in the world. And so their infantry were roaring away in Bren gun carriers and in trucks.
Leaving the tanks behind.
And these tanks could do on a good road, on a good day with a following wind, maybe 15 miles an hour.
So why do you think that was? Why do you think they had such slow tanks then?
I think it was engine availability.
Yeah, okay. So
As much as anything. I mean, we're talking design history now, though, so...
Well, but it makes me want to ask. What stopped them putting a better engine in?
Because if you build a better engine, you put it in a plane.
Yeah, okay, and the planes are way more important.
Yeah.
Didn't matter how slow your Matilda tank was if you're blowing up the enemy tanks with aeroplanes.
Pretty much. The huge breakthrough that came with British tanks, to get a little off topic, was when they realised that they had a whole bunch of plane engines that weren't airworthy. As in, you've got to meet certain reliability standards to put it in a plane.
Because it'll fall out of the sky.
If it stops in the air, you've got big problems. Yeah. If it stops on the ground, it's okay.
Yeah.
And then they said, let's put them in tanks. And that's suddenly, they put one into, I think, a Valentine, and it broke the speed testing.
Yeah, okay.
Because the speed test on the range could only handle 50 miles an hour, and this thing was zooming fast. And then from there, you had the Cromwell, and which was okay, and then the Comet, which was good, into the Centurion, which by many people's views is the best tank ever. And don't you worry, we'll talk about that in another episode.
We're going to talk about Valentine at some point too, hopefully.
Nice one, which was also a very good looking tank, although, yes, had its issues. It's
got a good name too, so...
It does. Let's talk about, why is the Matilda important?
Part of it is, I think it looks like a tank, so I think that's why it stays in people's memories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at least mine. I'm sure if you talk to anyone with even the vaguest interest in tanks, they would be aware of the Matilda at least as an image. If you showed it to them, they'd go, "Okay, that's a World War II tank." So I think that's part of it. I think that something that came up when I was talking to you about the Matilda prior to this was it was in every theatre of war. When I was reading about it, I hadn't realised that they'd shipped them to the Russians. But of course you would. I mean, if it's a tank that that you're mass producing and that is ending. I guess it's used by life for your military. Why not ship it to the Russians?
Well, in terms of shipping, it did have the virtue of being a very compact tank.
Yep.
And not being more than 25 tons.
So
if you try to unload it in a port that doesn't have a crane that can lift more than 25 tons, your tank's not going anywhere. I mean, the Americans built the Sherman up to 40 tons because every port they planned to use could handle a 40-ton load. But the Americans think in terms of much bigger ports than other people.
But as I said, the Russians didn't really use them much anyway because they were too slow, and they had the KV-1. Which
had a huge gun on
it. And huge armour, and it could blow things up.
Although my understanding was the Matilda was not poorly regarded by the Russians, who really...
Because it was tough.
Yeah, they really hated a lot of other tanks they got given under Lend-Lease.
I can't imagine them.
What do they call the Grant? The coffin for 7 brothers?
Yeah. Well, they were building their own awesome tanks. They were just filling out the ranks with what they could get from other countries.
Yeah, when you're fighting the Germans, you know, any vehicles to hand, gratefully received.
Because I don't think they got anything from anyone else that was better than what they were building.
No. Yeah. The best T-34, on a good day in the factory it was made, was an amazing tank, but the worst T-34 is a very different tank.
What about on average?
I don't think anyone has got real numbers or data on what an average T-34 looked like. They weren't designed for the crew to live very long, though, which isn't great.
Yeah, drive it in and hopefully destroy more things than
but before they die, they will die.
Which again, the Matilda wouldn't have been great for them because you're not killing a lot of other tanks with the Matilda, but I guess you could machine gun a lot of troops.
The machine gun. I mean, the Matilda I, which had almost no shared heritage with the Matilda II at all. It's a bit of a mystery why they ended up with the same name. Was just a machine gun pillbox on wheels, and that's having an armored machine gun that you can haul around the battlefield has some merit.
And a mobile pillbox. Then, if you think of it like that, then it does have utility. If you think of it more like that rather than a highly mobile tank, you think of it.
Yeah,
you don't have to build a new pillbox.
If I was in a pillbox, I'd like to be in one sort of set back from the battlefield, not pushed into the middle.
But that brings back to what was your question? Why is it such an important
tank? Yeah.
I think it's probably its use in North Africa.
Well, that's where it picked up the Queen of the Desert moniker.
Yes.
And in Operation Compass, it did extremely well, although some question whether the Italians' desire to stay inside their fortifications made them uniquely vulnerable to the slowest tank on Earth. Because even the Matilda could catch up with them.
But it played an iconic role there. So whether it turned to battle or not, it was a visible thing.
And also it did, because it had an enormous service with Australians, so that's a bit interesting for us, in the Pacific Theatre, where, again, the fact it was a small, relatively light tank, particularly for its heavy armour, meant that it could be... I've seen pictures of them with Mills boats opening their ramps onto the beach and Matildas rolling out of them to assault Japanese positions. So it was much loved in Australian service, so it served out the war with us. And again, in jungle fighting, 12 miles an hour is, 8 miles an hour is still faster than the infantry can walk through the swamp.
Yeah.
There was also a 3-inch howitzer version, which was no use whatsoever in the European and African theatres.
But in the close proximity of jungle warfare?
It was very handy for smashing open bunkers, and Japanese armour is not its most famous arm of military exploit.
No, and you tend, in jungle warfare, you tend to run into your enemy, literally.
Yeah, which is where a machine gun and 3-inch howitzer is pretty much your dream combination. They also had flamethrower versions and even a spigot mortar projector version. So how
many mortars? Did it have 8 or something?
6 or something like that.
Yeah.
Which would be a nice day at the office. You trundle forward, you fire 6 mortars, and then you trundle back to reload. And
did that one see operation?
I don't think that one actually did.
Whereas the flamethrowers did.
Flamethrowers definitely did. Yeah. Yes. But the importance, so it was the only tank, one of only 2 tanks to see action in all theatres of World War II, with the Sherman being the other. It was also one of only 3 tanks to serve out the entire duration of World War II, with the others being the Panzer IV and the T-34. So for such a weird little undergunned, often maligned tank, it
stands in famous company.
Stands in amazing company.
Because I don't think anyone would consciously put it beside those two tanks.
No one looking back now, you'd be like, oh, what's some really good tanks from World War II? Ooh, Tiger, Panther.
Yeah, no one goes Matilda. Yeah.
But I think if we get down to the brass tacks of the Iron Triangle here, which is something we're going to have to talk about with every tank that we talk about, you've got protection, you've got mobility, and you've got firepower. Its 40mm 2-pounder gun was just good enough.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting one, because if you can penetrate the tanks you're shooting at,
that's enough.
Well,
yeah. Yeah. It's can they get close enough to penetrate the tank?
Yeah. Now it had what's now a very standard crew layout, but it was reasonably revolutionary for the time. It also had a doorbell on the back.
Yeah. Okay.
So supporting infantry, because it is meant to be an infantry support tank, can ring the doorbell to let the crew know that someone wishes to speak to them.
Because I think it was the Australians that had a phone.
Yeah, well, they used the doorbell, because once you've got the wire there, you just put a handset on it, and you've got a phone. They're actually just now putting the phone back on the new model Abrams.
Yeah, okay, they took them off.
Well, they deleted it when they moved up from the M60 to the Abrams, and then they've discovered that even on a battlefield where everyone's supposed to be meshed and networked in a radio, being able to just pick up the phone on the outside of the tank and have a chat to the tank commander about what's going on is...
And that, to me, that tank commander knows they're talking to someone straight outside their tank as well, and vice versa.
Yeah.
They're in no doubt about where that person is.
Yeah, it's not someone in Peoria who's got on the wrong circuit. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you're going to take that person seriously.
Yeah. But they have a need to talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But getting back to the Iron Triangle, so they had to build a small tank. They had to build a tank that could be moved with 2 bus diesel engines, because they had no more, because at the time they were building it, as we said, any bigger engine was going into a plane.
Yep.
Same thing afflicted Australian efforts to build tanks in the dark days of 1941, where the tank builders were going around saying, well, can we have that engine? So, like, no, planes.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that until you've got a total overabundance of pilots, no, not even then. Yeah, but basically, given a choice between a plane or a tank, most militaries are wisely going to say, we'll have a plane.
Yeah.
If for no other reason, the plane can bomb the fuel dump of the tank, and then the tank's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Or blow up a bunch of tanks.
Yeah. Well, planes don't blow up tanks so well, but they really blow up their supply vehicles well.
Yeah.
So small tank, small engines, lots of armour though. Essentially invulnerable to most German fire unless they wield an 88. And for those who haven't seen them, 88s are big.
Yeah. It's not typical. It's not an infantry portable weapon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the Germans, it's even worse because they had such little mechanization at any point in the war that it's like a team of horses had to be dragged out of wherever they were keeping them and attached under fire to this gun to wheel it around. It's no small or minor business. Although anytime there's a tank coming your way, I guess that's worthy of some attention.
Yeah, definitely. So it's got armor. That's its main thing. But given the context,
they sacrifice pretty much everything for the armor. And also bear in mind when people criticise the tiny turret, that was a small turret ring. That goes with making it portable.
I wasn't criticising it.
Yeah, well,
I saw it as a positive. Yeah.
It can fit on trucks. It can fit on trains going through narrow tunnels. It can go through the village to get to the only bridge for miles around and traverse the bridge.
Yep.
And you can say, oh, this tank can do 60 miles an hour, but if it has to divert 300 kilometres to find a river crossing it can use, that's not necessarily doing you any good.
Now, was the turret mechanised?
Yes, I believe it was.
But as I understand it, you could move it.
I think almost all of the World War II era tanks could be hand crankable, and they often use the hand crank for fine tuning. So they'd use the power assist to get roughly in the right direction, and then.
But given I've not been in a tank. I've only been in a light armored vehicle with the turret, so I have no concept of being in there. But if its mechanization broke down and you had to hand crank it, I would think a smaller, lighter turret would make it much easier to use.
Yeah, I think at the point where you've lost power, you're thinking very seriously about getting out of the tank and running away, though.
What? Yeah, okay.
I mean, sure, if you're in fury, then you know.
I just think at the most basic level, the utility of
yeah,
whereas you'd be running. I guess I'd be running too. I'd be getting out of that tank.
Also, by that argument, you'd be like, oh, we should have a tiny little aluminium turret and just turn it around with our shoulders.
No, I wasn't going that far. I was thinking that I was looking more at the unintended benefits.
Yeah, and I think there was something the gunner actually manoeuvred the gun with his shoulder because it was light enough and well balanced enough. I could be wrong about that, but I think that was the case.
Well, I'm pretty sure I read that too, and which is why I was bringing it up. That I thought that while it was not ideal to have a small weapon and within that small turret, that possibly there were some unintended benefits where it could be just a little bit easier to use, which may give you an edge in certain situations.
Yeah. Which is sort of where this tank had its heyday, though, was those little situations. But look, we're just going to take a moment's break, and we'll come back and talk about those situations. So as the cicadas warm up in the background, operational history. Let's talk about some of those uses of the surprisingly useful Matilda.
Well, I hadn't realised that it had been involved in France in 1940.
Yes, the Germans really appreciated the ones left behind at Dunkirk. Although they did well at 15 miles an hour to get to Dunkirk in time to be left behind.
Well, so what did the Germans appreciate about finding that?
Just that they were a reasonably reliable, very heavily armoured thing. They didn't use them as tanks, because if you got Panzer IVs, you wouldn't.
But they did use them in North Africa, just to jump ahead of you.
Yeah, there are they were the ones they captured there. They didn't drag those ones from France.
Yeah.
But there was this huge German effort in France to take armoured vehicles, mostly French armoured vehicles, also the captured British ones, and use them as self-propelled artillery mounts.
Okay.
So they tore the turrets off and put other things in. But there are beautiful pictures all over the place of Matildas with swastikas on them and iron crosses and. There's also an issue with apparently the Imperial War Museum in the 60s did a repaint on their Matilda, and what was meant to be a shade of grey, they actually painted it blue, and then everyone said, oh, that's what the War Museum did, they must have all been painted this bright shade of baby blue. So when you see pictures of Matildas on the internet and they've got this baby blue on them, that's because the War Museum made a little misclassification. Well, you know what paint's like. You can think, oh, that's going to dry out grey, and then
it doesn't.
The next thing you know, you got a duck egg on your hands.
Well, that's an interesting fact.
Yeah,
maybe on the lookout for that.
There you go. But it did very well at Battle of Arras, where the British actually managed a brief counterattack and whole debacle. It was the fall of France. Again, the fact that the Germans had to wheel up their anti-aircraft guns, which you've got to remember, the anti-aircraft guns weren't sitting around with nothing to do.
No, they're shooting at aircraft.
They have jobs.
Protecting supply lines and things like that. Yeah.
And to suddenly say, no, you're not doing what you're meant to do. We've got to hit these tanks. But it's the two-edged sword of the way Matilda was designed and constructed. Partly, they had to grind out the armour to get it to the right shape. So they did the castings and then they ground it out. It was very manpower intensive.
Yeah, that would be laborious.
But it just, yes, it's almost unstoppable if you can encounter it. But when you're dealing with an army that's doing manoeuvre warfare, they just go around you.
Yeah.
You have to get very lucky. And I think this sort of comes back to where the British were slightly stuck. They get accused all the time of fighting the last war, but what people don't realise is the bit of the last war they were fighting was the idea that with a static enemy well in place, you need to do a lot of meticulous planning and staff work to make a successful attack.
Yep.
And suddenly in World War II, mostly because the Germans were high on Perdivan, they weren't sleeping, so that nothing stayed still for any length of time. Anyway, the point is Matilda was too slow, so on the one occasion where it did bring the enemy to grips, it did quite well at Arras, but there was a lot going wrong in 1940 in France.
Yeah, so the Matilda wasn't going to win them.
Yeah.
win the Battle of France.
And it didn't do that well in the Battle of Crete, but again, that was a bit of a debacle all round, and the Germans were just moving faster than... They were inside the feedback loop of the Allied forces in that campaign. But in the desert, particularly against the Italians, Queen of the Desert.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, do you think in part their success there was because they were fighting Italians rather than Germans? Because the Germans did turn up and they still did struggle.
Well, so I mean, Operation Compass was a resounding success, and it was mostly against the Italians, and it was a case of everything pretty much went right for the British forces at that time. There's been a lot made of questioning the bravery of Italian soldiers, and I think a lot of it is more that the Italian soldiers were just a bit smarter and didn't particularly want to die for their leader, whereas you've got to question the intelligence of. No, I don't want to say that. I'm not questioning the intelligence of brave and good soldiers. I'm just saying that
I wouldn't question the bravery of Italian soldiers. I think that they would have looked at their situation and made, like you're saying, intelligent decisions about, are we willing to throw down our lives?
And when's the soonest point I can surrender?
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't think that I wouldn't say that's a question of bravery. So,
yeah, but also, do I want to advance out of my reasonably safe trench and see what's out there? No, I do not. But then suddenly the slowest tank in the world is on top of you, and it's not good.
Well, probably the best way to survive is to minimise your risk, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's always the tricky thing in war, though, isn't it? You minimise your risk to the point you lose the battle, and
they lost.
Then you're hoping the enemy's prisoner of war's treatment is up to scratch, and you've got no control over that whatsoever.
But so, how did the Matilda fare once the German military turned up in force?
Well, once Rommel is performing slashing manoeuvres out in the far flanks, your very slow tanks just never really getting involved.
Yeah.
It's still got to be having some influence on the shape of the enemy, I guess. But I think it was becoming increasingly clear that Matilda's time was coming to an end, at least for open warfare. And then they had a bunch of these tanks, and the Pacific War was gearing up, and it was a beautiful serendipity that there were these tanks that were no longer suitable for European conflict, that were more than a match for Japanese armour, that had diesel bus engines that were, sure, they needed a lot of maintenance, but at the same time there were a lot more people who knew how to maintain them.
Yep. You just needed people that knew who'd work on a bus.
And with a limited number of plane engine technicians available, even if there had been the engines available, there would have been a bottleneck on the technicians. So it comes back to it was just eminently suitable, and a stonking great Tiger II would have been almost impossible to get onto a beach in Papua New Guinea.
So, which brings us back to something you said earlier, which is the right tank at the right time. And that's and you raised earlier why would people know the Matilda? And that longevity, and it is the right tank at the right time to be able to then go from Europe to North Africa and then to see out the end of the war in the Pacific.
I think there is also the issue that American movie culture defines our perception of World War II to an enormous extent. And that's why the Bren gun carrier, which there were 100,000 of the things made, they were scooting Allied troops all over all theatres of the war. You never see represented in popular culture. Almost no one's ever heard of them. And similarly, a tank like the Matilda that was used extensively in all theatres of the war is almost a what tank to most people. When a dilettante in the field will still recognise a Sherman or even an M3.
Yeah, okay, whereas I would but I'm the wrong person. I'm like, I love Bren carriers.
Yeah.
They're one of my favourite non-tank vehicles out there. And,
some of the modified ones were getting very close to tanky as well. But
well, the only ones I've seen other than with the guns have been with mortars on them, in terms of what I looked at. But
yeah, I mean, I have seen pictures of ones with not quite a turret on them, and I get that you really need a turret to be a tank. But I think what I'm coming back to is there is very limited cultural understanding of any tanks, Allied tanks, that weren't American ones.
So when people think of the Pacific War, they tend to think of America's engagement in the Pacific rather than Australia's engagement in the Pacific, and so therefore with that comes the American hardware.
Yeah.
So Shermans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they did use the M3s a lot as well, I believe. Australia used the M3s quite significantly as well. But yeah, so I think we've just about covered the Matilda's operational history. So a little bit in France, a little bit in Greece. Too slow but tough. Did really well at the start of Africa, mostly because it was perhaps fighting Italians who weren't quite as committed to the cause as the later Germans who caused troubles to the Matilda. And then just a reliable tank that fitted the bill really neatly for what was needed of it in the Pacific.
And then ended up in what is now known as the Army Reserve. I can't remember what the Australian Army Reserve was called. I think it was a citizen militia. It had different names. Yeah, so
I was in service there into the 60s, wasn't it?
Yep.
But, and look, I think if you're a reservist, you don't want a fast tank, do you?
I feel like you're very disparaging of reservists there. I've known some reservists that would very much appreciate a fast tank.
But if you're out for a weekend exercise, you don't want a tank that's going to get too far ahead of everyone, do you?
I just figured it was a tank that there were a lot of spare parts lying around for a bit.
I think that was most of it. Yeah, a tank that was worth absolutely nothing.
Yep.
And there are still quite a lot of them. They were used, sold off as agricultural surplus. So there are a surprising number of Matilda tanks sitting in sheds across Australia.
And they made good tractors.
Yeah. Slow tractors.
Yep.
But no one asked for a fast tractor.
And you could fix the engine because it was a bus engine.
Yeah, well, 2 bus engines.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Okay, I think that's us done for this week. You can reach us with comments and suggestions at totestanked@gmail.com. And we'll be in a bunch of social media channels real soon now, so keep an eye out for those and follow, like, subscribe, and of course, please review us if you've got this far, because those stars on early podcasts, they're gold to us.
And we'll be posting online our next tank choice.
Oh, we're gonna pre-announce the next tank, aren't we?
We should.
Okay,
yeah.
so keep your eyes peeled to Facebook, and we'll be back in a month with the next tank.
Good to talk with you, John.
No worries, always good to talk to you, mate.